Thank you very much to all the panelists for this. We're just going to take a few questions, a few discussions between us here before inviting comments from the audience. And I guess my first question sort of follows immediately from your presentation, Magali. I think you really identified an issue that I think we've discussed a lot in the context of reproducibility, which is the different types of incentives that are dominant in academia versus when you are in a situation where you are developing therapeutics for the clinic. And it seems to me that there is very often a gap because of this difference in incentives. And there have been several studies like that. It's because of the incentives that dominate in academia, you tend to have high profile papers, which involves large effects, small sample sizes. It's a driver for the type of results that are the results that you avoid the closest you get to the clinic, because you don't want surprises, you don't want extraordinary claims at that point. And so you've mentioned a few things about how to bridge that gap. You've mentioned prizes. You've mentioned trying to have these multidisciplinary things. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the things that have worked particularly well, as well as the things where you wish other stakeholders in this, be them funders, institutions, journals, how could they have helped better with trying to bridge this gap?
Yeah, I do think it's a gap, and I can understand why it's a gap. If you're doing basic science, it's so far away from some of these from the clinical end, and sometimes you don't understand how it is impacting. But the foundation of science is it's a pyramid, and if there's a problem with reproducibility at the base, then we're not going to make strides at the apex of this pyramid. So that's why we have brought together, and probably the most impactful approach has been to bring the people across that end of the spectrum together into one forum. And that includes statistical experts and computational experts and engineers, as well as basic scientists and clinicians, so that they could all really understand the impact that their science has beyond their bench. And I think that's something that I don't think that certainly people have visibility to, the impact beyond the bench. The other part I think is very important is disease modeling, computational disease modeling, especially quantitative systems pharmacology modeling relies on this type of basic science, and there isn't that much of a great connection between the modeling community, computational community, and the basic scientists, and that's another place where we bring them together. And we're seeing that once they understand that, that endpoint, that little data point that you just generated has an impact on our predictive modeling, then there can be better quality again.
What kind of support, or what is your wish list for other stakeholders in this to actually help with these kinds of initiatives?
Well, I'll start with NIH. I'm glad that they put out the reproducibility challenge. Putting it out there and recognizing the problem was the single most important thing that they could have done. They've done a lot more, to do some more training. But I was at a conference like this just 2-3 years ago where we said, well, why don't you have a fund for reproducing an experiment? So someone does an experiment that's an important one, have someone else fund reproducibility, and that individual laughed, and that is the issue, right? And the reason they laughed is because they said we hardly have enough funding to support the primary science, so-called, versus the secondary science, and that's a mindset. The idea and the notion that the reproduction of the experiment is secondary to the primary experiment is a fundamental problem. So that's the mind shift that has to change.
I want to turn to and ask you in terms of, you've mentioned as well the the role of IRBs in supporting sort of transparent, and I'm interested in that because they're early in the process, and we've heard some fantastic things that Gita is doing in really trying to look holistically at the institutional level. What would you expect more sort of from institutions as well, and in particular from IRBs and from funders to support this effort?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, IRBs clearly play a key role up front because that's when they can really shape how research is designed and conducted and reported in the protocol. The challenge is that depending on the country or the local jurisdiction, the regulation of IRBs is highly variable. So in a country like the UK, where there's a national regulator who can establish a set policy and then all of their research ethics committees need to comply, it's much easier to, for example, tie trial registration with ethics approval as a condition. In a country like Canada or the US, where there is no central governing body saying, you must require this in order to grant IRB approval, it is much more challenging. And we've had sessions at, for example, the annual Primer meeting, which is the annual meeting of IRBs in the US, and there's been hesitation to act alone. Having said that, there are examples of many IRBs that have required trial registration as a precondition, and we would hope that they go a step further to recommend adherence to reporting guidelines such as SPIRIT and others to improve the content of submissions. And I think part of it is promoting to researchers themselves that it's not just a stick, but there's a carrot in that if you submit high quality documents to us, then they're much easier to review, and that there should be fewer queries back to the research team to reconcile issues, and that would hopefully be seen as a positive in terms of reframing it as an incentive to adhere to these guidelines. We see it all the time in terms of pushback and the back and forth with the IRB committees, and a lot of it, as I mentioned before, is due to deficient content.
Gita, would you like to comment on that and whether there are things that you've done or you've seen done within the context of your institution?
Sure. So we went through a relatively in-depth review of our IRB, the Duke Health IRB, over probably 4 or 5 years ago. And what we found, particularly with regards to the delays that people routinely complain about, is certainly the content and the quality of the submissions. But it's also, to your point, as the IRB is early in the process, IRBs were being asked to do things that IRBs are not equipped to do. Mm-hmm. So it's really not their role to, if we're holding them, at least in the United States, to the regulations under the Office of Human Research Protections, then that's what we want them to be experts in. We don't really want them to be experts in publication requirements in a contract. We don't want them to be experts in managing conflict of interest. We want them to be aware of it and know how it might impact restrictions, such as whether an investigator is allowed to consent by themselves, all those sort of things. And what we found was that the holdup was really all the other aspects of the process to reach approval. And we were holding our IRB approval sort of hostage to all the other things. Mm-hmm. So we moved to a process of what we call institutional approval. And we're in the process of developing, my kids call it the pizza tracker. When you order a pizza, you can go online and see, it's not actually real, but you can see the dots move, like if you're ordered it, if it's in the car, if it's coming. So we have a process where you can track and see what parts of your protocol or your study or your project are approved. And where's the bottleneck? What's the holdup? And quite frankly, what we're finding is that the major holdup is contractual agreements. And it is on both sides. It's on the institution side. It's on the sponsor side, right? And so these are all things so it gets down to picking out what are the pieces and parts. And this is the same thing about quality. So if you utilize the CTSAs under NCAT's sort of efforts, came up with the ACTA, right? This is a standard contractual agreement that we have tried to employ with some of our sponsors. If we utilize that, we demonstrated a reduction like down to a third of the time it was to get an agreement in place. So I think things like that where we need to be looking holistically at what all the parts are that go to the delays, the frustrations,
And all of those things, in my opinion, are what lead people to find workarounds and go outside of the guardrails or the guidelines to get something done.
So, yeah, no, absolutely.
I think you make a valid point that IRBs are overburdened, and a lot of the pushback is, there are so many regulations we have to adhere to, and there's a lot. They were under-resourced already. So that is certainly a fair point, and a good way of dealing with it is to have a separate institutional arm, perhaps reviewing the quality or transparency aspects. Some of the pushback from investigators is often that, because there are some ethics boards or IRBs that do, in other countries perhaps, that do review kind of more the science as well as the ethics, recognizing that they're closely tied. So if a poorly designed study would be unethical, or it should be viewed as unethical to pursue and expend resources on in animals or patients' time. And so they are intertwined, and we do hear from researchers saying, you should be focused on reviewing the ethics, not asking us why we only have 5 patients in our study. But they're clearly intertwined. But as long as someone is reviewing it, then I think that's the key. Someone at the institution is approving it.
I'm going to invite the audience to line up at the microphone in the aisle. While you're doing that, I'm just going to ask each of you. You've all have a lot of experience in developing sort of these practices with your different perspective for clinical research in particular. If there was one thing, what would be your priority? If you could put something at the top of the priority list of a stakeholder, being the one you represent or another, for preclinical research, what would it be?
Well, I actually think that the discussions that were mentioned earlier about some sort of pre-project registration process, because even with clinicaltrials.gov, right, you can change it. I think there's this impression that once you put it out there, you're done. Because I know that in the preclinical space, there's a lot of discussion about people saying, well, it's iterative. As we keep going, we make changes. That's okay. And there's often not really a thought process of writing out a protocol. It's a hypothesis. There may be an analytical approach, but it's not a protocol. And I think some process of where we either get to a protocol type idea or registration process for those things would be helpful.
I would say that the top of my list would be to ensure there's adequate funding to conduct the experiment correctly. And by that I mean powered correctly. And especially in the preclinical side, there's a tendency to, and also our own, the ethics side of it, they'll want to reduce the number of animals for a variety of reasons. But unfortunately, that results in a result that is not interpretable if you don't power correctly. And often you can't do studies with 20, 30 animals reasonably.
I would draw from the lessons from the clinical trials registration example and say that journals have and can play a critical role in leading change. And I liked Brian's pyramid and agree that things need to happen at all stages. But for clinical trials, really, journals led the way, journal editors led the way, and only when they did, that fed into the researchers' desire to publish in high-impact journals, which is a long-term project to change. And then the resources came in. The more investment in clinicaltrials.gov, more investment from funders, from institutions, hiring individuals in their quality integrity offices to ensure that registrations were of sufficient quality. Educational resources. That only really happened because the journal editors put in the statement and requirement that trials be pre-registered. So I would, if I had a first wish, it would be that journals, recognize the importance of having a well-defined protocol for preclinical research, developing some sort of guidance for what should be in those documents, and then requiring that they be submitted along with the final report of the results, and that they be pre-registered in advance in order to be considered for publication. That would be extremely powerful. And there, of course, needs to be the infrastructure to support researchers being able to do that and the funding for them to be able to do that. But that would create a strong statement.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to turn to the audience, and we'll start on this side. Please indicate your name and your affiliation, please.
Gürkan Gardinier, long-time applied statistician. I would like to congratulate both the effort and the progress made in this field. Concentrate on two words that statisticians use, pre versus post. Sometimes we look at studies after they are done, after results are analyzed, and we apply a technique called meta-analysis. Go back 5 or 10 or 15 years in the literature, find results which either support what we found and report it, or find results that did not find things significant. Many times the studies are different in design. The tests applied to the data differ, sometimes appropriate, sometimes totally inappropriate to the subject at hand. So in this regard, I'd like to point out that statisticians have been working on that problem, but we found few resources of people addressing the reproducibility issue. Another meta is metadata. We talk about it, to put identifiers on the data, when they were obtained, how they were obtained, and recently there were a few cases where people wanted to rerun the tests because the substrate, the chemical had changed in between the trial. And a statistician would say, okay, do it in 2 blocks with this substrate versus that substrate, but record the time when changes to methods of analysis change in the data. So the idea of meta should be of interest to you, and the idea of what you're working as pre-preparation for collection data being important in the final analysis of the data. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And I think that in that regard, I don't know, Gita, if you want to say a little more about your interaction with the core statistics group.
So we have found exactly that, particularly with trainees, right, that they get very gung-ho, they're excited about their research, they often have some requirement to do that, and lo and behold, they have data that often wasn't even collected well when you go to look at the database that they've used, hopefully not Excel. We have a requirement to at least use REDCap so that they can do that, but then even the statistician they work with can't easily utilize the data. So we have implemented requirements where they at least have to have a consultation with the statistical core because we also see individuals who have degrees in epidemiology or something where they might not need a statistician to do every aspect, but they don't have all the details. So we put that requirement in place.
Thank you.
So Leslie McIntosh, I wear a few hats. I have my own company called Repeta, where I'm the CEO, and then I'm also the executive director for Research Data Alliance. And in a previous career, I was the director of the Center for Biomedical Informatics at one of the CTSA centers here in the United States. So thank you, first of all, for putting together a great panel. This was very nice, different perspectives. Particularly for Anwen and Gita, I'm interested in a question that you asked actually in the program, which is more about how do you get funding to implement more automated solutions for this. And I noticed, I looked up Scepter, which, it was so nice to see a checklist and then a tool that you could automate, some of the processes, and it looked like you got a lot of your funding from the Canadian the CHIR, I think it's the Health Institute of Research. Sorry if I mess it up. And then obviously at Duke, I would guess you might be getting internal funding, but how are you looking at funding these initiatives to move beyond, a theoretical or a philosophical solution to a more automated approach so that we can facilitate scientists getting back to their science and yet doing better science?
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, funding is always a challenge, whether it's for methodological research to identify the gaps that we're all talking about, to implementing solutions. So the development of the Scepter tool was, as you mentioned, funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the National Cancer Institute of Canada, and the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. So various interested Canadian government funders. As with any government funder, there's little interest in supporting the maintenance of these tools. The startup development is challenging enough to get grants for because it's not answering a research question. So that's where it has been a challenge. And our institution, in collaboration with the commercialization arms, have come up with a subscription model where those who can afford to pay would pay a subscription fee, and those who cannot, from lower income countries, for example, can access it for free. But it's an ongoing challenge. I mean, the researcher in me and the quality and transparency promoter in me wants to release it for free. If any of you are funders and want to support this on an ongoing basis, that would be great. But software development and maintenance has its expenses. And
So for us, for any sort of new initiatives, we often have leveraged our CTSA funds for something that's due, but then at some point it becomes operational, and that isn't what the CTSA is about. It's not to run, to keep the lights on. And so we essentially, for each of these things, and one thing I didn't sort of point out is I hope it wasn't taken that all the things that I mentioned that we're doing only started this year, right? Like we've been dealing with our cases and things for a long time. So when we get to a point of saying, okay, now it's getting into an operational phase, it's putting together a business proposal and taking it to the leadership of the school of medicine, the university, and so forth, showing what are a SWOT analysis, what are our risk benefits, and also with all the things that we do, this may be the scientist in me, we measure our impact and effectiveness for all the programs we put forth. We do acceptability surveys. We look at how many user metrics we have and dive down into what it is, not just a number of people that signed on, so that I can use that to leverage that kind of information to get internal funding when we move a lot of these things into operational structures. Yeah.
I will add that we are focusing on convincing institutions, and with our existing subscribers have primarily been institutional, in terms of recognizing the importance of promoting transparency and improving completeness of protocols. And so we would hope that institutions would agree to invest in these kinds of tools. So that's kind of a funding source, but it's an ongoing challenge.
Yvette Carter, Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Research Integrity, and in my previous lifetime, a surgery resident, and I did research in both basic and clinical science research in trauma surgery and pediatric surgery. So I have a couple comments and then a couple questions. One, at ORI, we've have done made some advancements in our image analysis expertise for all of our folks on the investigative side, so we can actually we're able to actually make more findings of research misconduct, or at least figure out which ones are honest error versus not an honest error. And then secondly, we also don't do the investigations. The institutions do the investigations. So my question or recommendation from the folks at ORI is for the journal editors, et cetera, instead of contacting the authors, contact the research integrity officer or the vice president of research at the institutions, or contact us at ORI, and we will take care of the upfront. Contact us earlier rather than later, so that's how we can actually make a finding of research misconduct and hence correct the literature. And then my question, especially for Geeta, one, appreciate the changes you've made, but due to, as a result of your most common or most current case that was in the news, the question that the new ORI director asks is, what can we learn from that, and what can ORI, the DEI side of ORI, teach everyone else? So since I'm on the DIO side, I'd like you to tell me, or any of you to tell us what ORI can teach the RIOs and everyone else out in the community of how to better improve research integrity.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things. So the case was settled as a whistleblower case for individuals who don't know and about those details, and it was essentially a case of overwhelming fabrication of data. This was it was data that was way too good to be true. So these are the kind of things that when you are getting that kind of information as a research investigator, we're excited, right? We're investigators. We're excited about the prospect of publishing in a one-word journal or publishing in anywhere that we can get that information out to the public, right? That should be the attitude. On the other hand, if you are getting it, I was talking earlier to Yvette, and I said, so my undergraduate degree is in statistics, and I don't crunch numbers anymore, but I work with folks, and when they hand me a Word document with tables, I say, where's the output? And they go, oh, no, you're fine, these are the tables. And I go, no, I understand what a logistic regression model looks like. I want to see the output, because when it doesn't make sense, or it makes perfect sense, you're like, what does that look like? And so I only say that to mean that people should be taking all aspects of their work to heart, and not just blindly depend on things that come forth and say that they must be true. We would never do that in the clinical space, right? I wouldn't just take something that someone told me was a finding. I would look at the test result itself. So these are the sort of things that I think are really impactful ways to tell folks to say, it's great if your results were positive, wonderful. You're going to be able to publish that. Maybe you should just look at the raw data. Maybe you should look at it and see if it makes sense, right? If you just look at the summary data and don't look at the fact that everything ended with a 0, right, in your Excel row or column, these are simple things that when you hear it, you think, how could that happen? It happens. So I think to take your work as your own and treat it like it is of the utmost importance to you will help a lot in managing some of those issues.
Thank you. Stephen.
D. Goodman, Stanford. I wanted to offer a one-word answer to your question about the highest priority for the preclinical, which is design. So everything that everybody says was a symptom of not reporting an element of design. And it turns out that many preclinical scientists are actually not taught design. Their proposals are, we're going to gather a lot of data and then we will analyze it. So if they don't know what design is, then a lot of the cause is lost right from the get-go. We did a survey of the PhD students to find out what stat courses they were taking. They were taking a phenomenal number of very high-level statistical learning, neural nets, everything. Very little foundational stuff. So you say, how can you build a pyramid if you don't have the foundation? But they weren't. But anyway, I had a question for Anwen and Gita. Anwen, the NIH, you know this, but perhaps better than I. The NIH put out a format for a protocol structure. To what extent does Spirit match up or not match up with the NIH format, and does that in any way inhibit uptake? And for Gita, for both of you, people are surprised to find out that protocols are not always examined in the funding decisions. So grant applications are looked at, but not necessarily protocols. So how do we get, except in comprehensive cancer centers where they have a specific funded structure to look at them, how do we get protocols to be examined more in the decisions about funding, and then, as Gita emphasized, some degree monitored after the initial grant to make sure that it was in any way followed?
Great. Just to comment on your first point, Stephen, the issue of training and on design also, as you know, applies to clinical research. So it's not just solely for preclinical. And in this day and age, there's no base threshold of training for people to do. Anyone can do research really without any training in the clinical field, and it may be a bit harder in preclinical, but I agree the training is essential. So you mentioned that the NIH does have a kind of a protocol authoring tool online. I think I'd be satisfied if everyone doing clinical trials in the world either used theirs or used the Scepter tool. There are some unique aspects of Scepter. So it is based on the Spirit guidance that has been adopted internationally and is being implemented not just in English, but in other languages. We've incorporated some management features, such as tracking amendments and so on, that can help throughout the process of maintaining a trial protocol. And then we've linked with clinicaltrials.gov, but also have contracts to link to the Australian registry, to the Chinese clinical trial registry, and other international registries with the push of a button. So I think it's great to have multiple options available to investigators, and we can kind of build off of each other and go from there.
I think on the second question about the lack of a protocol, right, at the time your grant goes to study section, so if we take NIH funding, some of that is being mitigated by the new requirements under the human subjects and clinical trial requirements for submission. It's not a full protocol, but it does have a synopsis, it does have your primary outcome, it does have the eligibility criteria. What's not clear to me, though, is whether, and I know there are folks in here from NIH, and I don't know if anyone wants to speak to this, but what's not clear is how much of that will continue to be evaluated, right? So when we submit annual progress reports for the next year's funding, this seems like an opportune time to say, does it match up with the things that you submitted or you told us you were going to do? So that might be one way to think about it. One issue, of course, that has happened for all the positive aspects of the changes in the Common Rule that happened, the requirement to determine concordance between your grant and your protocol no longer exists. Or that was removed. Now, part of the impetus behind that was that when you wrote the grant and when you go to get IRB approval, many things have changed in that time frame. And so to require it to be exactly the same led to issues and problems. And again, it was a question of why is the IRB held accountable for an NIH grant document to say that they are consistent, because the IRB is supposed to be evaluating this from an ethical and human subject standpoint. However, we've lost that opportunity to make sure that they're consistent. And so I think that's an opportunity for us to think about how to manage that differently.
Thank you.
If I could just comment on that, it is a clear issue that even two sources of information that should be in close proximity to each other are discrepant. It is a major problem. So we published a paper in JAMA a couple of years ago. Sorry, I actually shouldn't have mentioned what journal it was published in. That's totally irrelevant. Totally irrelevant. So we did a study where we compared the trial protocol approved by an IRB to what was in the trial registry, which is supposed to happen around the same time, to what is eventually published. And a significant percentage, over a fifth of the protocols, the primary outcomes defined in the protocol, did not match the primary outcomes in the trial registry, which is in quite close proximity to each other. There are reasons why it may change for the paper, the final journal article, but so even then, why may that be? It's hard to know, but there should be some check on it, or at least at a minimum, these sources of information, if they're made public, then any interested party can look at it, even though if it's not being checked prospectively.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks to the coordination issue that Brian raised earlier, right? Which is about how do we get these different actors who all have an input in the process to actually act in concert, or at least to be transparent with each other to facilitate that. Yeah.
And I think any tool that can link, so someone mentioned copying and pasting from the same Word document. I mean,
that's what most people do.
Exactly.
Or they copy from the grant, and they write in the background of the protocol, or they copy from back and forth, and that's why there's errors. And they also aren't thinking of writing a protocol; they're filling in space.
And so we can have, if an electronic tool is kind of the source database for the protocol information, and that can just be exported to the IRB, to the trial registry, and so on, then that can ensure that the information is consistent. It's coming from the same place.
One other thing too to consider is that there may be a disconnect. As someone said, as you said earlier, that people are learning all these high-level statistical courses and not in design. It may be legitimate to say that an investigator may not be the one to write the protocol. Quite frankly, there are people who are expert in industry. It's highly likely that there are people who are specialized in regulatory requirements writing the protocol. That doesn't mean they're not working in direct concert with the scientist to put forth the ideas, the hypothesis, the objectives, the primary outcome, but it's someone who's a regulatory specialist putting together a protocol. And so when we look in our own institution, when somebody has a regulatory coordinator on their team, the likelihood of IRB approval, or the time to approval, is rapidly faster than if it's an investigator-initiated junior faculty who doesn't have a regulatory coordinator to rely on, or someone who can just check for them and submit it. I mean, so that's another aspect.
I would second that, particularly in terms of the informed consent. I have seen some really shocking examples. Yes, and often, and sometimes just written by junior staff who have no background and experience. I was curious for the Spirit documentation, your database. Is it possible to link that to finally a final publication so that when someone finally publishes, there's a link back to the original protocol?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the concept of kind of threaded publications that Doug Altman published about years ago, where the protocol is linked to the registry record, which is linked to the journal article. I mean, there should be some common identifier across them all. I think that's an important concept, and so certainly in this day and age, with various software platforms run by journals for protocols and for IRBs, there should be a way to link them so that they're automatically transmitted.
Perhaps a GUI tag or something for every protocol as it's generated, and then you can link them.
Right. And I will say the medical writers are one of the common subscribers to the Scepter tool. And for trial registration, it's often a delegated task to someone who may or may not be as familiar with the concepts that they're copying and pasting into a trial registry. So that could partly explain some of the quality issues as well.
Mm-hmm. I am Stu Hoffman from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Research and Development. I'm the lead for TBI research for the office. And so when I came on my current role, this question's going to be for Magali, basically. When I came on my current role about 9.5 years ago, I was thrown right into the mix of the interagency development of common data elements for traumatic brain injury. And that eventually led to the Federal Interagency TBI Research Database, FITBR, which is based upon the autism database that's also housed at NIH. But being part of the government oversight committee for this Common Data Element Development Committee, it was pretty, I would say, extremely shocking the battles that went on between the academics that were trying to settle on the common data elements. A lot of them were neuropsychologists, and some of the responses were almost what you would expect if you were on a desert island and your child got voted off the island. So, but anyways, it came out of that with a panel of common data elements, and so studies are going with their data into the Federal Interagency TBI Research Database for large meta-analysis to see if they could detect any positive results across studies or understand the data better. The emphasis for this came out of the fact that there was no successful clinical trials for TBI. So okay, that's where we are now. Now there's a movement to have common data elements for preclinical studies, so that you can have that transparency and have some sort of comparing of apples to apples across the clinical studies. What is your thoughts, I guess, how this will be taken, at least in the translational community, where preclinical community, where a lot of times people were perceived to be experts in a technique, being sort of channeled towards using a technique that is a common data element?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, common data elements are essential for the data sharing open science movement, right? They're the only thing that's going to allow us to harmonize across all of these different groups and labs and everything, and know that we're putting together apples and apples. And in a data commons like ours, we rely on both common data elements and common data standards, which is a whole other thing unto itself. As you know, the FDA requires CTSA standards for data to be submitted. There are a number of standards, and we need those as well. I think as much of a challenge as it is in the clinical realm, where there's probably, well, as I remember the traumatic brain injury one, there were a couple of hundred different scales that we're all fighting about which ones are the most important ones to prioritize. I think that in the preclinical side, it's going to be an even more challenging thing. But the NIH did put together a preclinical common data elements working group, and I believe they're getting close to finally publishing those results. I'm actually not sure of the status. I know our team is part of the team. So they did make strides in developing them. Now the question is the adoption. And I think that is just back to this question of carrots and sticks. How do we show the community that's using these that it matters, and that being able to combine their data and reproduce it in an independent way is important to the validity of the science they're doing.
Thank you. And that will be the last question.
Tom Kern, Children's Mercy, Kansas City. This is for Geeta. Geeta, you epitomize the old adage that the sight of the gallows in the morning concentrates the mind. Very familiar with the cancer case. I knew some of the principles involved. Pretty much, and I feel that I'm speaking on behalf of many people in the audience and the future audience to any report coming out, I'd like to implement everything that you're doing in my own institution. Is there a way to help me do that? Can you append something to documentation that, particularly the areas that you've made pretty mature and could be implemented?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. We appreciate that. I will absolutely say, first of all, I have a great team. So, this is me being the voice and leading an amazing team who put a lot of work and a lot of thought into these things. We have published a paper on our RCR program that's in accountability and research, and we paid the open source fee, so it's available. I spoke recently at the ORI conference at Northwestern back in May, and I think those slides are publicly available, but I'm happy to share those as well, that talks about just our overall RCR program that includes the multiple components, because as I mentioned, there's city modules that you can do. People feel like that's putting needles in their eyeballs if they have to sit and look through one more click and just answer some questions. Somebody said that to me. I think it was maybe a surgeon. But anyway, I'm a surgeon too, so anyway. But people have really picked up on the idea that they can be a part of the solution, and we really like that. And so I'm happy to share any of our materials with anyone that would like that. But we are planning to put them out. And I will say, for those of you who are thinking about your career and all those sort of things, it's funny because I still do research in my own field, but I'm looking at this as a path for research, right? We should be evaluating it in a systematic way and publishing it so that people can either take it and reproduce it or take it and implement. So we plan to do that as we continue to move forward as well.
Thank you. We will now break for lunch, and we will reconvene here at 2 o'clock. Before we break, I would like you to join me in thanking our panelists who've been really fantastic.